A Nightmare on Elm Street was a series of horror films I always sort of enjoyed as I really got into the slasher genre. For me, I got into slasher films through the Halloween series, which would play a lot during AMC's The Channel Not the Theater Chain's annual horror movie marathon. The idea of a masked man killing people intrigued 12-year-old Connor. Since as a superhero fan, I almost saw these guys as superheroes with the convoluted lore and everything. And rather than going set piece to set piece doing justice or what have you, they would go set piece to set piece killing unsuspecting teenagers. I didn't really care that many of the people in these films had shallow characterizations. While Michael Myers was becoming a star, a few other characters in a similar but perhaps more flashy 80s stylings also emerged to try to get some money off of what was built by Michael Myers in the slasher genre. These were many, but a few notable characters were Chucky, Jason, and of course Freddy Krueger. I have, for a number of years now, been working on a retrospective series for Friday the 13th films, and in a play set to perhaps make everything even more complex, I figured I'd also review Nightmare on Elm Street films as a way to come full circle when I talk about Freddy vs. Jason down the line. Wes Craven would create Nightmare on Elm Street, the franchise, with him being a relatively newcomer to horror, but having the ability to add some depth to the genre. Before this, he created The Hills Have Eyes and The Last House on the Left, with the latter being worked on with Sean Cunningham, who would create the Friday the 13th franchise, perhaps another sign of everything coming full circle down the line. Wes saw a lot of articles in the wake of the Vietnam War which saw among citizens unable to sleep, causing them to die, which Craven noted was a particularly horrific and interesting way to die, and this eventually led to the creation of the fairly unique slasher character Freddy Krueger, who invades people's dreams and causes them to die in various ways. He would also take some influence from Dreamweaver, a Gary Wright joint that would add synthesizer to the soundtrack and created a stronger vibe of what Craven was going for. In the early drafts of the script, Craven wanted Freddy to be murdered for being a child molester, but around that time in the 80s, stranger danger was a major talking point in the American news media, and Craven didn't want the film to be an exploitation of real current events.
Last year, 50,000 children disappeared, many of them from nice, safe neighborhoods.
It's okay. Come on, help me.
Talk to your children about not talking to strangers.
So this was retrofitted into a child murderer instead. A lot better, I know. Craven developed the character pretty thoroughly beyond his origin, drawing the name Freddy Krueger from a childhood bully, who he also named a character from Last House on the Left after. Added a red and green sweater because he read that it clashed in the human retina, and picked a burned face design after being startled by an elderly person as a child. The knife glove was also just a gimmick Craven came up with to differentiate him from famous slashers that preceded Freddy, having standard household things like a knife, chainsaw, or machete, which also perhaps added a bit to the overall fantasy themes of the character. Craven started to shop the project, and the first one to bite on the IP was Disney of all companies, hoping to tone down the thing and make it a PG or PG-13 soft horror film. Craven declined as he was really hoping to make a harder horror film, more akin to the slasher genre. But other major studios declined the pitch, not seeing the potential in the project until finally, New Line Cinema, an independent studio founded by Robert Shea that was mostly in the film distribution business, decided to take a shot with Craven's pitch and make it the first production they would produce. New Line being a micro studio that at that point would take the reins on establishing investors for the project after pitching it to a number of people. They gained the funds from several private investors, and they did this since they didn't actually have much money themselves, being just a small distributor at the time and not having done any productions of their own. This, however, would allow Craven to work on the project and not be tied down to the pitching process as much as he otherwise would have when he started pitching to the majors. Casting Freddy was a challenge with them at one point, considering the large Jason stunt actor Kane Hodder, before hiring stage actor Robert Englund to play the slasher and add some personality and a dreamy feel. The film was shot over 32 days and edited quickly, wrapping shooting in July with a targeted November release. The story follows Nancy Thompson, a teenage girl who lives on Elm Street with a number of her friends that are being haunted by dreams of a mysterious gloved-wearing man who begins killing the teens off one by one. As she unravels the mystery on who this man was, eventually it comes to light that it basically is just a demonic entity of a man named Fred Krueger, who was burned alive after a group of parents found out he was a child murderer.
He was a filthy child murderer who killed at least 20 kids in the neighborhood.
Nancy realizes that Krueger survives off the fear of his victims, and when she confronts Freddy calmly and unafraid, he's weakened. Freddy lunges at her but has no power any longer, and this leads to him evaporating. However, Nancy seemingly wakes up to it all being a dream where her and her friends are alive, and Freddy makes one last attempt on Nancy, at which point the film ends. Like most Hollywood slasher films, especially of the day, action set pieces from your standard Hollywood film are replaced with kills, and this film does a good job creating a horrific environment for those kills to thrive. The film has a relatively small 4 set-piece kills, which is much less than most films of the genre, with most of the horror coming from a psychological perspective and being somewhat of a slow burn in this first entry. The kills are each very dense, with the best probably being the first kill, Tina's, which sees Tina being bloodied while going on the ceiling. The worst being Rod, who's just hung. But also notably, a pre-superstar Johnny Depp as Glenn is essentially sucked into his bed and blended up, causing his blood to fly everywhere. This is also arguably the best kill. There's a couple really solid kills in this film. This wouldn't be the last horrific bed event for Johnny Depp, though.
Here's a photograph of the bed, our bed, and on my side of the bed, was human fecal matter.
Freddy in this film feels fairly reserved, but it was kind of before the really wacky sequels came along, so while he's definitely more overtly confrontational than other slashers, he's a bit more reserved and scary, despite us getting an idea of the wacky superstar Freddy would become. Nancy, on the other hand, is your stereotypical, slightly flat final girl trope, in the same vein as Laurie Strode. This is the aspect of the film I find the most standard. I'm surprised, given Wes's history, he didn't think outside the box a bit more on this one, but I think Heather Langenkamp does pretty good for what her character archetype is, given the fact that she's just a POV of what the audience has seen. Wes would later expand a bit on this character when he does his proto-Scream meta-sequel, Wes Craven's New Nightmare, which we can talk about eventually, so I think it worked out in the long run, and I think she did pretty well here for what she was given. Tonally, this film has a bit more psychological thriller elements than many of its rival franchises, which are set-piece vessels. Like I said, the set pieces are incredible, however much of the film's suspense comes from Nancy and her friends trying to uncover the mystery of Fred Krueger and attempt to not sleep and give him the opportunity to make them his next victim. Freddy isn't sneaking up on people. These kids are fighting their own biological urges to sleep in order to keep away from Freddy, which is unique and interesting and sets it apart from Jason, Michael, or Chucky's more random crimes of opportunity. Freddy hunts his prey with patience rather than stalking, which is sort of an interesting twist. The dreamscape also allows for Freddy to have a slew of unique kills and unique looking kills, which makes the production team's creativity and essentially what they can dream up a little more essential than a lot of the rival franchises. The music is synth heavy, which works pretty well. It doesn't have a major score like Halloween, but the light ambient synth, I think, feels artificial and dreamy, and also adds brilliantly to the feel of a psychological teenage slasher film from 1984. It uses popular sounds of the time to add a level of relatability, while also making it ambient, ripe for suspense. The editing in this film is pretty well done. I mean, it's somewhat flat, but the actual kills are edited pretty well, making it look pretty natural for the most part. Nightmare on Elm Street's cinematography is bright and sterile, with some interesting stuff done during the scenes with Freddy to really play up the nightmare in the Nightmare on Elm Street. It was shot by Jackie Hakini, who worked consistently on small projects and is likely most well known for this film and its sequel, Nightmare on Elm Street 2. I think A Nightmare on Elm Street's a pretty solid film, which adds to the plethora of achievements Wes Craven's made in his lifetime, along with films like the Scream series and of course Hills Have Eyes, Last House on the Left. Freddy is interesting, and while some things like the final girl and the archetypal Middle America town aren't wholly unique, the few kills it has are intriguing and worked in a more thorough sense of psychological horror and a unique method for this serial killer demon guy that works pretty well. Is it the most interesting film in the franchise? No, not really. and it's far from Wes Craven's best, but I can see how this film caught the 80s American repressed audience by storm when it came out, playing into the societal fears of stranger danger and the inescapable killer masterfully. A Nightmare on Elm Street made $57 million off of a budget of $1.1 million and launched New Line's first major franchise, with them making 9 films to date, and much like its other successful contemporaries, making a character that has stayed in the minds of people for now decades. The Prophet would also go on to start New Line's ascension from the underdog film distributor to a large film company that would do the famous film adaptations of The Lord of the Rings with Peter Jackson, and would eventually produce films in the Friday the 13th and Texas Chainsaw Massacre series as well. New Line became the house that Freddy's built, a name the company lovingly owns to this day. The film reviewed fairly well back in the day actually, being called refreshing compared to its derivative cousins.